I drove over a bridge I didn't remember, and halfway across, the guardrails disappeared. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog. The road had narrowed without warning, the asphalt thinning into a pale strip that cut through open farmland and low trees. No streetlights, no reflective paint, just my headlights carving out a small, trembling tunnel through the dark. When the bridge appeared, it did so quietly. No sign announcing it, no change in pavement, just a subtle rise and the dull, hollow sound of tires passing from road to concrete. I didn't remember a bridge being out here. That realization came a second too late to matter. I was already on it, already committed, the fields dropping away on either side into darkness I couldn't measure. Then the guardrails vanished. Not gradually, not crumbling or broken. They simply stopped. One moment there was the reassuring flicker of metal in my peripheral vision, and the next there was nothing between me and the open air. My stomach clenched, hands tightening on the wheel as if the car might drift of its own accord toward the edge. I slowed to a crawl. The bridge stretched ahead of me, longer than it had any right to be. My headlights reached only so far, their beams swallowed by mist that clung low over whatever lay beneath. Water, I assumed. A river or drainage canal. I listened for it. The rush, the slap against stone, but heard nothing. The silence felt deliberate, padded, like a room designed to absorb sound. I checked my mirrors. The road behind me looked normal. Narrow, yes, but intact. Guardrails firmly in place, their dull metal catching the light. For a moment, I considered backing up. The thought made my chest tighten. I drove forward instead. Each foot of progress felt exaggerated. My awareness stretched thin over the act of keeping the car centered. The absence of rails created a strange optical illusion, as if the bridge were wider than it was, or not there at all. I had the disorienting sense that I was floating, that the road beneath me was a suggestion rather than a structure. Halfway across, my phone chimed. The sound made me flinch. I glanced down despite myself. No signal bars. No notification. Just the time, blinking as if it couldn't quite decide what hour it was. I laughed softly, the sound brittle. "Get it together?" I muttered, the words falling flat in the enclosed space of the car. The bridge did not respond. The far end came into view slowly, emerging from the fog like a thought taking shape. Relief loosened something in my chest. I crossed the remaining distance and felt the subtle shift as concrete gave way to asphalt again. Guardrails reappeared without ceremony, lining the road as if they had always been there. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. It was barely more than a cluster of buildings around a single intersection. A closed gas station, a diner with darkened windows, a post office that looked like it hadn't seen mail in years. I parked beneath a flickering streetlight and sat for a long moment, engine ticking softly as it cooled. I told myself the bridge had been old, poorly maintained. Maybe the rails had been removed for repairs. Maybe the fog had played tricks on my depth perception. There were explanations, even if none of them felt quite right. Inside the diner, the smell of old grease and cleaner hung heavy in the air. A man sat at the counter nursing a cup of coffee. His posture slumped, shoulders rounded as if he'd been there a long time. "Long drive?" he asked without looking at me. "Longer than I expected," I said. "Is there a bridge on the road out there?" He paused, just a fraction of a second too long. "There's a crossing," he said. "Been there a while. Does it have guardrails?" That made him look at me. His eyes were tired, bloodshot but sharp, assessing. "Some folks say it does," he replied. "Some folks don't notice them missing until it's too late." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to. When I left, the fog had thinned slightly, enough to reveal the road curling away from town like a ribbon laid carelessly across the land. I drove on, telling myself I wouldn't take that route again, that I'd check the map, find another way home. The next bridge appeared an hour later. Same shape, same quiet rise, same hollow sound beneath my tires. My heart sank. I slowed before I reached the midpoint, eyes fixed on the edges of the road. The guardrails were there, solid, unbroken. Relief washed through me, warm and disorienting. I exhaled, muscles loosening despite myself. Then, as my front wheels crossed the center line of the bridge, the rails were gone. I stopped the car. This time I got out. The fog pressed close, beating cold against my skin. Standing there, inches from the edge, I peered down into the blank space beyond the road. The drop was impossible to gauge. No water, no ground, just depthless gray, as if the bridge spanned not a river but an absence. Behind me, the road stretched back into fog, its surface unbroken, ordinary. Ahead, more of the same. I became aware then of marks on the asphalt. Faint at first, easy to mistake for oil stains or old tire tracks. But they were too deliberate for that. Too consistent. Footprints. They led to the edge of the bridge and stopped. I followed them with my eyes, a cold understanding settling in my gut. Some were older, edges softened by time and weather. Others looked recent, fresh. All of them faced outward. I got back into the car and drove. I don't know how many times I crossed that bridge after that. The landscape began to blur, towns repeating with minor variations, diners staffed by different tired-eyed people who all avoided my questions in the same way. My fuel gauge never seemed to drop below half. My phone's clock no longer meant anything. Eventually, the fear dulled into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or resignation. It wasn't until I caught my reflection in the darkened window of yet another roadside diner that the final detail clicked into place. I was wearing a jacket I didn't remember owning. On the sleeve, barely visible beneath layers of wear, was a faded patch stitched with reflective thread. A county road emblem, the same one posted at the edge of the bridge, on a sign I was suddenly certain I had driven past many times before, warning drivers of missing guardrails ahead. And beneath it, in smaller letters I somehow knew by heart, use caution, turn back while you can. I don't remember ignoring that sign, but I must have, because tonight, as the fog thickens and the road rises once more beneath my tires, I'm starting to suspect the bridge isn't something I keep finding, it's something I never finished crossing. The static and the sobbing. The emergency broadcast system activated, but the message was just static and sobbing. At first, I thought it was a malfunction. The thin, high-pitched whine of the siren filled the town's quiet streets, rattling windows in their frames. I pressed my hands over my ears, leaning against the peeling wood of my porch railing, and the sound seemed to burrow inside my skull. Even when I lifted my fingers, the sobbing remained, somewhere behind the static, behind the signal, almost as if it had always been there. It was 3 in the morning. Normally, nothing stirred in was hollow at this hour. The town had been shrinking for decades, a cluster of shuttered storefronts and empty houses, and the few residents who remained clung to routines the way birds cling to power lines during a storm. I was one of them. I had moved back after my father's funeral, drawn to the isolation like a moth to cold light. The town hadn't changed, but everything felt different now, like I had arrived in someone else's memory of it. The streets were empty. I could hear the wind whispering through the skeletal trees along Main Street, and the low moan of the river that cut through the town. The broadcast continued, the siren's wail punctuated by bursts of static, and that quiet sobbing that didn't belong to any person I knew. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stepped down from the porch and walked toward the town square, each step crunching on frost-hardened gravel, the sound unervingly loud in the frozen silence. The hardware store's neon sign flickered sporadically, casting long, stuttering shadows across the pavement. Inside, everything was in place. The cans of paint, coils of rope, stacks of boxes. But I felt eyes on me, or at least the impression of them. A cold draft slipped between the shelves as though something had moved, though the door hadn't opened since I arrived. I tried the radio again. The emergency broadcast remained, the voice buried beneath a veil of static and sobs. No one answered my calls. Phones rang endlessly, cutting off before anyone could pick up. I drove down the narrow roads toward the hospital, a building I had passed countless times without a second thought. Now, from the distance, its windows were dark, but the emergency lights above the entrance pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I parked, leaving the engine running. The sobbing was louder here, though no one appeared outside. It wasn't human, or at least not human in any way I recognized. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered. I walked the corridors, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air, undercut by something earthy and decayed, like wet soil after a long winter. Rooms were empty. Wheelchairs and stretchers stood in unnatural angles, as if they had been abandoned mid-motion. The sobbing grew louder, echoing down the hallways, and I realized it wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was all around me. I reached the nurse's station. Papers were scattered across the counter, as if someone had fled in a hurry, though the chairs were perfectly still. A monitor flashed with static, the EKG traces jumping erratically before collapsing into a jagged line of white noise. I pressed my hands against it, and for a brief second, the sobbing became clearer, closer, more intimate. It wasn't crying in distress. It was crying in recognition. I ran out the back door into the alley behind the hospital, where mist clung to the ground like a second skin. The siren's pulse felt synchronized with my heartbeat, each wave of static a hammer striking at my temple. I stumbled, almost tripping over something in the fog. A shadow darted across my peripheral vision, too quick to define. I swung my flashlight, the beam catching only fog and frost. The sobbing became almost human here, almost pleading. I reached my car again, but something stopped me before I could open the door. The fog thickened, pressing against me from all sides. The siren ended abruptly, leaving only a ringing in my ears and the faint echo of those sobs. I tried the ignition. The engine refused. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered my name. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakable. The kind of whisper that doesn't come from the air but from inside your own mind. I forced myself to look toward the town square. The street lamps were on, but the light was wrong, smeared, as if reality had been stretched across a canvas and then shaken. Figures moved there, just at the edge of clarity. Their shapes were vague, like smoke caught in wind, but I could feel them observing me. I could hear them breathing in sync with the sobbing, a chorus of voices folded into one. I ran through alleys, over cracked pavement, past the silent storefronts, but each turn seemed to lead back to the square. The fog followed, thick and persistent, carrying with it the sound of muffled crying and static that bit into my thoughts. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a single notification. "We see you." My reflection in the darkened windows blinked, but I hadn't. I reached the edge of the river. The current was higher than I remembered, swollen, restless. I stared at the black water and the mist rolling off its surface. The sobbing had changed now. It was rhythmical, almost a chant. And then I realized that somewhere in the fog, the static had stopped. Silence replaced it, total, suffocating silence. And then the town spoke, not with words, not with sound, but with a series of impressions that struck me in memory and dream at once. You were always here. You always belonged. You are alone but not alone. The lights in the town square flickered once more. I blinked, and when I looked again, everything was different. The buildings looked older, decayed beyond recognition. The streets were cracked with weeds pushing through asphalt like fingernails. Figures stood where the square had been, stationary, faceless, waiting. And yet the sobbing had stopped. The emptiness pressed around me like water. I took a step forward, into the square, and the fog swallowed me. Behind me the river roared. Behind me the town whispered, and I realized I had never left, had never truly arrived. The static had returned, low and throbbing, and somewhere beneath it, I thought I heard laughter, soft and wet, like water seeping through cracks in stone.